Welcome, Magnus here. Today's video we're going to talk about what is my favorite PlayStation console and why this particular console out of the main line of PlayStation consoles really is something that is not only hard to come by but did something that none of the other PlayStation consoles have done as well. And it was so well, Sony had a reverse course. So stick around and we'll see to it. If you like this channel and like to talk about games, nostalgic games coming back to life, and in this case we're going to talk about nostalgic systems, consider subscribing. And of course, I'm a huge Shenmue fan, so those who love Shenmue, watch my channel as well. Sony's PlayStation up to present day. Now, it had a heck of a boom start, and even though there were a few rocky years, it's pretty much the #1 console as of today when it comes to PlayStation 5, and the most units sold in history when it comes to other video game systems that they put out. Now, I am the proud owner of all of the PlayStations, 1 through 5, mostly original models, though some of my models have gotten tweaked. Not only do I own them all, I remember what the gaming industry was like when the first PlayStation was released up until PlayStation 5. So first I'm going to talk to design changes and where the industry and technology was with each console. And then I'm going to focus on why I think this particular PlayStation is the diamond in the rough when it comes to PlayStation consoles. And the one that I feel that, it's hard to come by, but I will never take it off of my TV stand. So without further ado, let's get started. So around 1995, the original PlayStation was released. Now, the design of the console was pretty straightforward. Just a CD-based console, 2 controller ports, 2 memory card ports, and then in the back you had connections to go to your TV via RCA cables, and then of course a plug to plug into power. Very basic, very small, minimalistic actually as well, because if you compare it to the Sega Saturn, which was another 32-bit console released by Sega, and it was CD based, it's much larger than the original PlayStation. Yet the PlayStation could handle polygons better than the original Saturn. So this basic design was with PlayStation really just trying to enter the market and design a console that looked similar in style to most other consoles and go forward there. Jump forward to 2000 when the PlayStation 2 was released. Now, the PlayStation 2 was supposed to be exciting. It had an emotion engine. It could render 10 million polygons per second. This thing can play DVDs, and it looks sleek and trendy. Now, when Sony was designing this console, they actually designed it with the ability to stand up. Now, that had a purpose. The reason is that in the time, throughout the mid to late 90s, computers were generally under a monitor. So they were like consoles, pretty much staying flat. But then, in the late 90s to early 2000s, computers started to be standing upright. And those type were actually trendy, and everything was moving forward to like upright computers rather than side computers. Now, the PlayStation 2, in its marketing, besides being a DVD player, was marketed as could potentially replace your computer. And there was actually the ability to load Linux from the PlayStation 2. Now, the PlayStation 3 could do it, but the PlayStation 2 did it with a disc. Now, the PlayStation 2 that I actually have the network adapter and the hard drive that came with Final Fantasy XI, so it's pretty much decked out. But there was also a port that was on the original PlayStation 2 that's not in this PlayStation 2 because my original PlayStation 2 that I bought back then got ruined. But now you know pretty much the design of why they did it. Tall, and the system tray coming out was just to make it look like it belonged in your entertainment system, because it was a DVD player. So those were fancy at the time. Moving forward to 2006, the release of the PlayStation 3. Now, the PlayStation 3, that's a story, and it's got its own several models, but this model that I have right here is the original 60 gigabyte version. Now, this model came with 4 USB ports in the front. It had card slots for compact flash cards, SD cards, and memory cards that were specific to Sony in particular. The back ports had the old school ports from the PlayStation where you can hook up the RCA cables, or an HDMI port so that you could plug it directly in HDMI, which it was actually better than the Xbox because the Xbox only let you connect component cables and you had to buy an adapter to get actually HDMI to work. And then it also had the plug was actually a traditional computer plug that most computers worked off of. So the ports in the back, rather than being proprietary, are finally starting to move towards something next level. Now, the design of the PlayStation 3 was very sleek. Now, everybody knows that they used the Spider-Man font on the original PlayStation 3 for the PlayStation 3 logo that's on the front. But this thing was heavy. In fact, the 60GB console version that I own here is heavier than my PlayStation 5, even though the PlayStation 5 is taller. But there was a lot of beef in that system. Now, that system not only had the PlayStation 3 engine, but it also had a PlayStation 2 motion engine, and it could emulate PlayStation 1 games. So it had a lot packed in there, as you can see. And it had a nice chrome design. It had a lot packed into it. I'll tell you the story about the PlayStation 3. I'll come back to that, but that was the kind of design. And they still had the standing design as well. Now, they still had the ability to also install Linux on the PlayStation 3, but firmware updates eventually took that ability away. Anyway, moving forward. PlayStation 4, around 2012, just a few years later, PlayStation 4 was launched. Now, one of the things that happened with the PlayStation 3 is that it got the yellow light of death, which Xbox suffered from and the PlayStation suffered from, meaning that the fans would get hot. The heating was not very well designed on that big bulky system, so they did system redesigns, and they wanted to continue to have that focus of being able to keep the system cool and efficient and small. So they had that in priority. But one thing that they changed and revolutionized with the PlayStation 4 that they didn't do with the PlayStation 1, 2, or 3 is that each of the original first 3 PlayStations had their own custom chipset, their own engines, and it was somewhat difficult to program for the first 3, which also made backwards compatibility, especially on the PlayStation 3, very expensive and difficult to do. Now, the PlayStation 4 was the first Sony PlayStation console that didn't, out of the box, have backwards compatibility. And that upset many gamers, but there was a reason, and I believe that that reason was justified. And the reason is they decided to use a very broadly accepted chip design, like an x86, I believe, type of chip when it comes to its graphics and its processing, which is basically like computers and makes it super easy to program for. Especially if you make games for PC, you can port them very easily to the Sony PlayStation, and it would work flawlessly. Now, there are a lot of custom parts in there, specifically like the AMD GPU that's in there as well. And I don't know particularly all the specs. By this point, it starts to get a little crazier than what I can actually remember. And the decision was, amongst the design, keep it cool, even though it could be loud after using it for a while, but not as loud as the original PlayStation 3. But keep it cool, keep it efficient, and also make it so that if they have to do future backwards compatibility, because it's all going to be based off of this PC Engine style, it'll be very easy to carry out backwards compatibility. Now, the connection ports, it ditched the PlayStation I/O port that was on the first 3 consoles as well. Again, this is transitional. It did wireless controls just like the PlayStation 3 did. They reduced the amount of USB ports because that's kind of a decision they made in the middle of the PS3 days. So they just kind of carried it over to the PlayStation 4. And it supported Blu-ray, which was huge because there was a war at the time between HD DVD and Blu-ray. And once again, Sony said, we're doing Blu-ray. Xbox at the time was like, we're going to do HD DVD. PlayStation won that fight hands down easily, and then Blu-ray stuck around. HD DVD kind of went the way of the dodo. But the PlayStation 4 had a lot going for it, and it had a lot to kind of work with. And moving forward from the PS4, and now that we're in the PS5 days, it's really started a trend for Sony. And one thing about the PlayStation 3 that I wanted to add on is that they created the PlayStation Network in the PS3 days. They made it free, where Xbox Live you had to pay for. But they created a centralized network, which was awesome. The PlayStation 2 could actually do network gameplay, but because there was no central server, each game you needed to create a username and password, and each game was hosted in online servers that belonged to the developers of the games, rather than having a centralized server for all network games. Alright, fast forward, the release of the PlayStation 5. Now this was a transitional system as well too. Now this, they decided to do 4K Blu-rays. So 4K or Ultra HD Blu-rays was the new disc that was going to be managed. It's like every PlayStation console had a new disc. PlayStation did CDs. PlayStation 2, DVDs. PlayStation 3, Blu-rays. PlayStation 4, Blu-rays. Okay, maybe not all of them, but at least now we have the UHD Blu-rays, which is pretty cool. And the PlayStation 5 came with a lot more USB ports in the front and the back, because now we're really connecting a lot of devices in that similar format. And the controllers are using USB-C to connect, which is awesome. But the PlayStation 5 in itself is once again huge, because they need to keep the system not only cool, but to run these advanced chipsets, they needed to make sure that they can produce that. And of course, again, it's working with a PC chipset, which allows the backwards compatibility of PlayStation 4 games natively and easily running on the PlayStation 5. And that's why Sony made that move and decided to cut off the 3, 2, and 1, because those were too complex, and you cannot continue to support backwards compatibility if you don't make it easy and similar chipsets as you upgrade. So that in itself was a no-brainer. Which one of these is my favorite? Which one of these is really the trendsetter? And which one of these is my crown jewel? I'll have to say that's the PlayStation 3. And the reason why the PlayStation 3 is so important to me and its history, I have to talk a little bit about what happened with this hardware model that I own in the industry. Now, the PlayStation 3, exciting. It was the leap from standard definition to high definition gaming. So that is astounding. Now you were able to play games on your widescreen HD TV, which those were relatively new at the time and not everyone had them. It also introduced graphics that we've never seen before that really were leaps and bounds over the PlayStation 2, especially when it came to resolution. And the ability to storytell even better on the PlayStation 3 was incredible. But if you know anything about the launch of the PlayStation 3, it had two original models, a 20 gigabyte and a 60 gigabyte hard drive model. Now the differences were not just in hard drive. The other differences in the two original models was that the 20 gigabyte version only had two USB ports. It didn't have that chrome in the front where the disc slot was. And it also only supported backwards compatibility with PlayStation 1 games. So you couldn't play PlayStation 2 games on the 20 gigabyte version. So 60 gigabyte version, you could play PS3, PS2, PS1. Like I said, it had the card slots, it had the chrome finish, it had 4 USB ports. It had a lot that they packed in there. And because it had the PS2 built in, it had the Emotion engine in it. So when it came to launching the system, the original price of the 60 gigabyte model was
$599 US.
Crazy expensive. Sony knew that this was going to hurt their sales, and it did. Xbox 360 already had a year lead. It was already rumored that it was so difficult to program for the PlayStation 3 that most developers just liked programming for the Xbox 360, and then when they ported it to PS3, games would look crappier. So why overpay for a console, and your Xbox 360, which is a year old, has games that are coming out looking way better? So that was part of the problem that Sony noticed. So they had to really come up with a design, because they were already losing money, even though they were selling it for $600. They were losing money. They're like, how can we drop the price and somehow compete and not change what we're doing with this system? Well, we're going to have to look at the innards and see what is making the price cost so much on the original Sony PlayStation 3. So one of the things that they had to sacrifice is the PlayStation 2's Emotion engine. What did that mean? They can still sell the console, but they just remove that engine, and by keeping that chipset out of it and then of course replacing things here and there, they were able to save a lot of money. But then what does that mean? No PlayStation 2 backwards compatibility? No. What they decided to do is have the PlayStation 3 emulate the PlayStation 2. So there was another batch of consoles that were released in the PlayStation 3's lifespan where if you bought the more expensive console, I don't know if by that point they moved it up to 80 gigabytes, or it was still 60 gigabytes, but just had that different model number where they were just emulating PS2. When that happened, they dropped the price from $600 to $500 for the more expensive PlayStation. And that's when I decided to buy PlayStation 3, but the original models, because I knew they would just sell out of those, and then they would start selling the emulator version of the PS2. But hold the phone, they weren't done redesigning because they still needed to drop the price even more. And this is before they created the slim version. So Sony, again, losing money, being frustrated, they're like, you know what, supporting backwards compatibility in specifically this emulated version of the PS2 is costing us more money. Why? Because now you have to make sure that your PlayStation 2 games are working with your emulator, because every game has to be tested to ensure that the emulator is working. Because honestly, a lot of emulators aren't perfect. They may be able to run 99% of the games, but if 1% doesn't run, then that's going to create a PR nightmare, and it's not a true backwards compatible system. So what Sony did was say, you know what, going forward, we're going to offer an 80 gigabyte model or 120 gigabyte model, something like that. And this model is no longer going to support any backwards compatibility. 2 USB ports. They removed the card slots because, quite honestly, and I'll tell you this, it was useless. The original idea was, hey, you can see all your pictures on your TV. Like, you take the pictures on your camera, pop it in your PlayStation, and you could see it on your TV. Nobody did that. Nobody even cared to do that. And there were some hacks on the PlayStation 3 that if you popped in the card and then ran an executable off of the photo browser, you can kind of get around things. But anyway, we won't talk about that. They wanted less vulnerabilities on the PlayStation 3, so they took those out. And there you go. And then only after they did all that, they created the PlayStation 3 Slim, which kind of made the PlayStation 3 a lot smaller, gave it a new logo, and just went with that. So now I own the original PlayStation 3 fat version, which was with all that innards inside of it, because it's backwards compatible with PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1 right there. And you can insert those games and play them without a problem. So why would I need to have my PS2 and PS1 connected to my television when the PS3 is 3 consoles in one? So it makes it a lot easier. So having that, and then the PlayStation 5, 2 consoles, all the generations of PlayStation in one. And the fact that the PlayStation 3 that I own, the fat, is so rare, it makes it feel extra special for me. Oh, and in case you're asking, if you notice that in the video footage, I show plastic on top of the PlayStation 3, that's because the original design, it was like a fingerprint magnet, and it would look gross. So I own the original model, but it had the yellow light of death. I had it repaired. It got the yellow light of death again. And when I send it back in, I just told Sony, like, because they kept on suggesting, why don't you get the Slim? We'll send you the Slim instead. I was like, screw it, send me the Slim, because I still have a PS2 and a PS1. So they sent me the Slim. For some reason, a couple years later, the Slim died. I like connected to the TV, turned it on, dead. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. I got the Slim so that it wouldn't die. And it died. I can't even explain. It didn't have a yellow light of death. It just wouldn't turn on. And I didn't try turning it on or off like during a firmware update or anything like that. It just died. And I couldn't get even into the BIOS menus, which usually you're able to do by holding a couple buttons. It was just dead. So rather than get another Slim, because I'm like, I miss having the fat because the fat just made it convenient, I went to a GameStop that actually advertised that they had the original fat model. When I walked in, I was like, you guys have this model? Yeah, we do. They gave me the box, took it out, said this is it, and I gave it a quick glance, took it home, popped in a PS2 disc to make sure, didn't work, wasn't compatible. Went back to the same GameStop. I'm like, this is not the fat model. They're like, oh, sorry, we'll get it. They got another one. They took it out. It seemed to have a chrome finish, so I was like, oh. Took it home, popped in a PS2 disc, did not work. I should have checked that it was the 80 gigabyte version where they removed the Emotion Engine and removed everything right before they went to the Slims. And I was like, damn it. Took it back, and I'm like, no, not again. I need my fat. That's what I paid for. So I'm going to get it. So then they were like, oh, sorry. And I was like, can we test it here? So then they did test it. And then they gave it to me. Now, when they had it, it was wrapped in the plastic after the refurb. So it's not original packaging plastic. It's like the refurb plastic. So I've never taken it off. So maybe it has fingerprints, but I'm hoping that it doesn't. And I've just left it on there because I'm like, you know what? I don't want my fingerprints all over this thing, especially if I one day look to resell it. So anyway, that's that story. I thought I'd finish off there. It's kind of a long video, but a lot to say about PlayStation. Which PlayStation do you think was designed the best? Again, I think the PlayStation 3 does the most for me, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. See you guys next time.